Sector Report is proudly brought to you by Tower, Rural Insurance Specialists.
Welcome to Tower Sector Report. I'm David Beatson, and this week the focus is on the red meat growth revolution and handling the hazards of modern agriculture. We're at the red meat sector's first major conference to see how its new strategy is shaping up. And we're checking some of the new concerns about health hazards facing farming families. Well, the red meat sector has just had its inaugural conference. Beef, lamb and venison farmers mingled with meat processors and exporters to focus on the new red meat strategy launched recently by the Meat Industry Association and Beef and Lamb New Zealand. The red meat sector is already one of New Zealand's big earners, but the strategy says it could grow sales more than 42% between now and 2025 and lift its earnings from $8 billion a year to more than $11 billion. Our Rural Affairs correspondent Drew Chappell was in Rotorua checking out the mood of the sector.
Not many phrases evoke more masculine imagery than red meat. For decades following the foundation of farming in this country, sheep and beef cattle have propped up the nation's economy. Now just the third largest New Zealand industry behind tourism and dairy, the red meat sector is still synonymous with manliness. The cowboys and shepherds of folklore idealised in entertainment. For the last 20 years though, and in particular the decade just gone, wool and red meat have been on the wane, as higher returns for dairy have driven conversions that way, displacing our traditional strengths. The last 12 months have seen significant improvements in both demand and price for red meat, revitalising the industry and drawing new enthusiasm from farmers around the country. It is in this context that the Meat Industry Association and Beef and Lamb New Zealand teamed up, commissioning accountancy firm Deloitte to draw up a strategy report for the red meat industry.
That's one thing that we've been pushing throughout the strategy process is that, the sector's an $8 billion sector compared to the dairy industry that's $10 billion. Not many people would realise that, and so this is not a sector that's dying. This is a sector that's integral to New Zealand's success and the performance of the New Zealand economy. What the strategy talks about is the fact that if we adopt the recommendations in the report, then we can actually add significantly to that wealth for not just our sector but for wider New Zealand.
In a show of unity within the industry, the two organisations invited various representatives from the farming, meat processing and marketing arms of the sector to a conference in Rotorua. It's the first of its kind and the organisers hope the first of many.
100% of the industry is here from a processor point of view, and we've got a very good representative group of farmers here who are equally enthused about working on this project. Prices have been good, and a lot of people have said, look, this has taken some of the pressure off the need to do some things which are going to improve the profitability of our sector, but in fact they're all saying, hey, this has given us some breathing space in order to be able to work out better, how we can do things better.
Conference delegates were treated to a numerical feast as visiting international experts pointed to a bright future for an industry enjoying its time in the sun.
We're looking at price rises in real terms for all the meats, and we're looking at an environment in which food security and sustainability is absolutely on everybody's agenda. It doesn't mind whether one's talking about a consumer, or a retailer, or a politician. This is top-line agenda.
Following a huge on-farm gross revenue increase of more than 15% last year, all eyes at this year's conference are on the global currency markets. A predicted exchange rate of around 81 US cents would see another increase this year, but smaller this time, just 1.2% for the coming season. A volatile decade of mixed returns since the start of the new millennium has somewhat levelled off for sheep and beef farmers over the past 3 seasons. While profitability is still below where most would like, the higher international prices are offsetting an exchange rate between 75 and 85 US cents. Professor David Hughes from London's Imperial College says in order to profit from foreign cultures, we have to first understand them, and right now we don't.
It's important to understand that in New Zealand, in Australia, in the UK, North America, we're very meat-centric, that we define the meal by the meat. And so what's for Sunday lunch? It's roast, whatever it may be. And of course that isn't the case in, for example, China, where you get a multiplicity of different dishes, and that's the essence of a meal. And it's like anything else in marketing, you've got to get under the skin of the consumer, under the skin of the shopper, and work out what do they value and what are they willing to pay money for. It's not just send them what we like and they'll just turn out like us. That's not the case.
It's widely understood that New Zealand's key selling point is in the perception of our high quality, clean and green products justifying a heftier price tag. Professor Hughes believes we're not selling our story strongly enough, because it's the story that will convince foreign buyers to reach deeper into their pockets.
You're not particularly strong on storytelling, and once we get past great taste and putting product in a form that meets the lifestyle aspirations of consumers in emerging markets, it's about the story. You've got a great story to tell about clean, green, clean water, the safety, traceability aspects, but it's got to be more than that. It's just sort of building that New Zealand story and then driving that down to the individual brand level, where companies can develop a brand which sits nicely under the umbrella of this sort of clean, green image of New Zealand.
This focus on marketing makes up a big part of the sector strategy report, emphasising the importance of brand New Zealand in maintaining the high returns of recent years. Mike Peterson says industry organisations like Beef and Lamb need to ignore the effects of things like the exchange rate when deciding on a focus, because ultimately they are out of our control.
The reality is, we've got to make sure we focus on the things we can control and can influence. So there's no point really talking about, things like the currency are frustrating, at times, but we can't influence what's happening in America around their economic pressures. So, look, we can influence the things and the areas where we have control, and we should focus on that to make the sector perform better.
Keith Cooper says as the CEO of a processor, he has a unique insight into the industry's interior problems. He says most companies' hands are tied by the inflexible reliance on price schedules determining farmer loyalty.
What I think some of the commentators missed is the challenges that having a group of farmers that are largely price driven, not all the time, but a large proportion are price driven, and they will alter whom they supply based on the price of the day, versus supporting a business with the right strategy, a strategy that that farm will believe in. So a second part of the story, and that's the big part of the challenge of the red meat strategy document, is how do we make that connection between farmers, the growers, and the businesses and the marketplace. At the moment they're not connected by and large.
He says the more events like this conference go on, the more united the industry will become, hopefully prompting some better outcomes.
When our constituents, when the growers are relatively happy, they do tend to take the pressure off meat companies. So I think all around we've perhaps found a level where we can all coexist on a sustainable basis, which is healthy. I think that's being reflected amongst the people and the attendees at the conference.
While the report sets out a reasonably positive outlook for the sector, leaders aren't satisfied with coasting along on the tailwind of high prices. The industry is looking for another $3.4 billion by 2025, something Mike Peterson says is ambitious but achievable.
If you actually look at that $3.4 billion in real terms, that can be achieved by 2025. If you divide that by the total amount of land that's farmed under sheep and beef, that's another $420 per hectare for the sector. And then, of course, the challenge will come in how that's distributed between, farmers and processors in the exporting sector. But it's an important measure because we're really focused on achieving that goal. And if we can do that, the sector's performing well. And so we will judge ourselves annually and measure progress against that on an annual basis to make sure that we are acting as we talked about this morning.
As we move into lambing season, farmers will be keeping one eye on the weather, one on the currency markets, and if they have any spare time, they'll probably be watching a few games of footy. But while the All Blacks do battle on the pitch, there's another battle to be fought and won.
If you look at what's happening in meat and what we expect will happen in meat over the next 20 years, it's a pretty rosy future, but I'm saying it's not without its challenges, and it won't be a straight line up. There'll be ups and downs and all over the place. And those that really understand, get under the skin of the consumer and the shopper in these emerging markets, those that really understand them are the ones that will win.
Drew Chappell reporting. So how are the red meat producers, processors and exporters shaping up to the challenge of their new growth strategy? We'll find out next on Tower Sector Report. Welcome back to Tower Sector Report. Well, Agriculture Minister David Carter had some words of warning for the red meat sector. The recent improvement in meat prices and the sector's current positive outlook doesn't mean its challenges are over. Sustained profitability won't come from price swings on the commodity market or from individuals acting in isolation. The longer-term underlying issues depressing the sector's performance need to be addressed. To see how the sector's shaping up to that challenge, we're being joined by Bill Faulkner, the chairman of the Meat Industry Association. Bill, you've had your first conference. What was the representation across the sector like?
We had a good representation from the industry members, from the Meat Industry Association members, and probably about 130 from our companies. We only had 30 from beef and lamb members, from the farmers. A couple of reasons. One, I think it's a new concept for them. It's not something that we'd done before, and it was right in the middle of lambing, and it wasn't a convenient time for
time to perfection.
So we had what you might call the heavyweights from the farmers' side, but not so many of them.
The conference was really your first big reality check on the strategy. What kind of reception did it get?
First of all, a meeting largely of processors, of exporter processors, who carry a considerable share of the responsibility for getting the recommendations of the sector strategy implemented. They're the ones that actually have to secure more money out of markets and more return out of processing in order to be able to reward farmers more to establish sustainable profitability across the sector. It doesn't happen by itself. Somebody's got to be out there developing the market and getting the returns for developing the market, which will create more money across the sector.
Well, the strategy actually sets a staggering growth target. Does the sector accept that challenge?
I think if you're talking in terms of increasing exports from 8 billion to 14 billion over the next dozen years or so, it looks to be huge. I don't think there's any doubt that the market demand is there. It is a hungry world. It's a world which is seeking protein, the sort of stuff that we can produce. Whether or not the profitability is in it, in order to encourage farmers to reinvest in livestock, to take land back from dairying, as it were, whether the profitability will be there to create a land use shift backwards into sheep and beef farming. I suppose most would say, well, we'll find out, but it's worth the effort.
So there's still quite a way to go to get the involvement you need to have strategy across the board.
There's a commitment to pursuing best practice to see that we can get the best out of the market, yes.
I noted that you looked at other sector strategies such as aquaculture and dairy products. What was the point of that?
The red meat sector strategy talks about cooperation between processors and exporters in market, and there is a bit of that already. It's not something which is new, but aquaculture has developed that what they're doing with green-lipped mussels in China to a new level, and we thought their experience would be valuable for the meat exporters to assess what they do. Now, I hasten to add, the New Zealand Lamb Company in North America is a classic cooperative exercise of people working together in the market. And there have been examples of companies working together on a smaller scale in developing markets. But the aquaculture guys have decided to do this as a deliberate strategy, which they've invested in, and we just thought the experience would be worth sharing.
So would you see that kind of approach extending outside the square, say to other sectors like transport?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. I mean, the thing is that people talk about production, processing and marketing, but logistics is such an important component in our value chain, across our value chain, that transport rationalisation, distribution rationalisation in our markets could be a very valuable source of improved profitability.
The Agriculture Minister says that the industry's got to address what he calls longer-term issues. Is there any agreement on the industry on just what those longer-term issues are?
The longer-term issues are several. At home, it's a question of land use, competing opportunities for land use, forestry, dairy, beef and lamb, lifestyle and so forth. Then you have the question of a longer-term issue relates to a transference from high-margin markets in the developed world in the Northern Hemisphere to emerging markets which have volume but not margin. The longer-term issues are the emergence of corporate farming, and all of these things impact on the way in which we do business, and we do you'd be foolish to pursue a strategy without having an eye to them.
Minister Carter warned that no one in the industry should be lulled into inaction by the current conditions that we're seeing. Do you think there's a danger that that'll happen?
I think the people that are doing well are just doing so much better now because of prices. The people that were possibly down the scale are saying, now I'm doing okay, and the drive to do better may not be as acute as we would have wanted. But the reading we get across the board is people are saying this is an opportunity to accumulate the capital to make the kind of decisions that we need to make for the longer term. And the reading we get is that everybody's conscious of that, not rushing out to spend money on new tractors unnecessarily.
Well, they say if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. What are the prospects for some kind of independent progress monitoring on how the strategy is being implemented?
Very strong. The sector coordinating group, the group that we've installed in order to monitor implementation of the strategy, is already working to set up metrics to measure what's being achieved, people that will do it, and the way in which we'll be able to report the results. And if we don't do that, then nobody will know.
So what's your next milestone?
We're very cautious not to put a number on year one.
Well, what about year two?
No, the next milestone will be to have a meeting such as that we had in Rotorua last week, whereby people can report to and be accountable to progress, and hopefully that'll be a good outcome.
Bill Faulkner, thanks very much.
My pleasure.
Bill Faulkner, Chairman of the Meat Industry Association. Coming up, how healthy is our farming life? And is it being threatened by the use of hazardous substances and new organisms in agriculture? Stay with Tower Sector Report. Welcome back to Tower Sector Report. Well, recently we covered the start of a new spraying campaign to save the country's kiwi fruit crop from the devastating PSA virus. Now the Green Party is calling for a halt in the campaign because the antibiotic streptomycin in the spray could enter the food chain and reduce its effectiveness as a vital human protection against infection. Zespri counters that there's no risk in using the antibiotic spray before the kiwi fruit flower, and the Environmental Protection Agency would not have authorised the kiwi fruit industry to use it if there was a danger of residue in the fruit. Streptomycin spray is also used in apple orchards as a protection against fire blight, and here it's used on the blossom, but not the fruit. And as if that wasn't enough for 1 week, out came a Massey University study showing the incidence of blood cancer among families who grow up on livestock farms is 22% higher than it is for those who do not. So what are farming families to make of all the news about the risks they face from the use of hazardous substances and new organisms that are employed in modern agriculture? That's a question I took up with the Federated Farmers Specialist on the subject, Dr. William Ralston. Dr. Ralston, you've certainly got a raft of issues on your plate, but could I come to one that probably will worry more farming families than anything else, and that is the recent Massey research finding that there's a high incidence of blood cancer among livestock farming families. What did you make of that?
Well, these sorts of studies are just one piece of the jigsaw puzzle, and I don't think that single bit of information is anything to be particularly concerned about.
Wouldn't you be a little concerned if you were living in and working in an area where blood cancer is actually 22% higher than average? Which is what I thought.
Well, I think we need to put this in context, and that is that these sorts of studies are done. They show a relationship between two factors, but they don't show cause and effect. So we really need to look. I mean, this is the beginning or a useful piece of information. Certainly reminds us that farmers need to be vigilant in terms of use of chemicals and their safety practices. But there may be some completely different reason why that relationship actually exists, and it may be as simple as the social situation in terms of livestock farmers. It may be as simple as it being statistically outside the norm.
Is there a process that would be followed when somebody actually has a finding like that, which I guess will cause concern?
Well, Massey will look at some follow-up studies. They'll be thinking very hard, as they explained in their paper, as to what might be a plausible link between those two. They'll want to look at overseas studies. We're not the only farmers in the world. Other areas have similar practices to us. So you'll be wanting to look overseas and see if that's actually replicated. So science is an ongoing process of taking a finding, and then actually the real thing about science is you then try and disprove that. So you only come to a conclusion when you have exhausted most possibilities.
All other possibilities.
Exactly.
Okay. There's another controversy, of course, over streptomycin use in agriculture. And we're seeing it being used now in combating PSA in the kiwifruit orchards. What has prompted concern about streptomycin?
Well, I think there are two things about using antibiotics in farming. One is a simple chemical issue and one of chemical residues, and I think the kiwifruit people are asking those questions at the moment. And the other issue is about build-up of resistance. So let's just take the chemical residue one to start with. Certainly our regulatory agencies monitor residue levels and won't allow those things to go above safe levels. And we also have this debate about natural versus chemical, and we must remind ourselves that just because something is natural doesn't mean that it's safe, and just because it's a chemical doesn't mean that it's dangerous. So you monitor the chemicals and make sure the residues are below safe limits. There are resistant bacteria to all of these antibiotics in the environment. In fact, in our human gut, we have millions of bacteria that are resistant to antibiotics. So it's not whether you have a chain of antibiotic use and resistance, it's whether you actually are increasing the antibiotic resistance, and that's something that science needs to ask us.
Presumably, one would have to increase the use of the causal agent, which in this case streptomycin. What are the trends in streptomycin use?
Well, actually,
we presume that there's going to be a bit of an uplift with the kiwifruit industry.
Well, quite possibly that there will be with kiwifruit, but certainly in the last year or so, the use of streptomycin has actually gone down in agriculture.
Could I ask you, are the New Zealand regulations on both hazardous substances and new organisms aligned with international best practice, if there is such a thing?
Well, at least they are, but I think we do have some issues in terms of our regulations in the HASNO area, and that is that they are quite cumbersome, and it is actually very difficult for new chemicals to be used, new products to be used in New Zealand agriculture, but just because the registration process is so difficult, in so long, and we're such a small market, companies tend not to want to use them. So in that respect, we're tending to be left with the older products rather than the newer ones. It's a bit like, our car fleet 20 years ago when we had very old cars rather than the very new ones. And science moves on, products get better and better. We need to be able to have that innovation and get those products into market in New Zealand so that we actually benefit from those products.
Dr. William Ralston, Federated Farmers spokesman on hazardous substances and new organisms. And that's all for now. Remember, you can catch our show again anytime via the internet at www.country99tv.co.nz. Thanks for your company. I'm David Beatson for Tower Sector Report. Bye for now.
Sector Report was proudly brought to you by Tower, Rural Insurance Specialists.